Thanks for tuning in, folks. Today I'm going to take you behind the scenes as I get my RX-8 ready for its first track day of the year. We're going to swap tires, swap brake pads, swap spark plugs, and also give the car a once-over to make sure it's ready for prime time. For 2026, I'm planning on using Bridgestone RA71 RSs on my 17x9s. You guys have seen these wheels previously, but those are for Autocross, and since this is a track event, I'm going to be mounting up my Falken RT660 Pluses. Now, why the difference in wheels and tires? So for SCCA time trials and for track days, I'm allowed to use a 10-inch wide wheel. So I've got my old trusty NK RPF ones in a 17x10. I decided to go with the Falken RT660 Pluses, mostly because they are cheap and durable. They work okay in the wet. They'll churn pretty respectable lap times in the dry, and I've heard that this RT660 Plus compound is a nice step forward from the old RT660 compound that I had used previously. So the name of the game here is durability and heat tolerance. You can get, 5-6 laps that are pretty decent before they start to fall off from overheating. The same can't be said for the Bridgestone RA71 RS. This tire is very much a one and done, one lap time trial specialist. It works very well for Autocross because it pretty much grips right from the start and doesn't need a lot of heat for that compound to activate. It also has fantastic grip in the wet. But the downside to these tires, if you use them in lapping situations, they are going to wear very, very quickly, and you'll only get a couple of laps when they're performing in their prime anyway. So RT660 Plus on a 17x10 for track, Bridgestone RA71 on a 17x9 for Autocross. Now yesterday I had checked the alignment for the first time since installing the Bilstein PSSs. So we're going to go in, we're going to lock down all of the adjusters, but while we have the car up on jack stands and with the wheels off, it's a good opportunity to swap to our racing brake pads. I run Hawk HPS on the street, but I'll be putting on Hawk DTC 60s for this upcoming track day. And I'm going to be bedding in new rotors and pads, so this upcoming weekend will be a great opportunity to break these new brakes in. But also it'll be my first event competing in the dry on these Bilstein PSSs. So that's going to be really my first opportunity to let you guys know how the Bilstein PSS performs on this car in dry conditions. While we're in here, this is going to be an excellent opportunity to also show how I do the spark plugs on the RX-8. With that as an introduction, let's get started. All right, folks, we're here at the rear brakes. I'm going to crack this caliper loose. I've got the parking brake released. We'll get these rear pads on, but while we're at it, we will inspect the brake hardware and the brake seals, and we'll make sure that this caliper slides freely. This caliper is recently built. I rebuilt it in 2025 here in the garage. The front calipers I rebuilt this season, so I would recommend, especially if you're into a lot of track stuff, that you rebuild calipers at the front perhaps as much as a yearly basis, and the rears every couple of seasons or so. What you want to make sure is that the caliper piston retracts very easily and goes all the way in, and that the piston boot is in good shape. If either of those are not the case, you are probably due for a caliper rebuild. So I am using my trusty square tool to get this to retract. I was seeing a little bit of binding of the boot there just because it's a little dry. You could hit it with some silicone, but I might not need to here. Actually I might. So I'm going to get a little silicone spray here just to lubricate the boot. All right, we'll see if that helps a little bit. Get the piston fully retracted. And you want the piston to not only be fully retracted, but to be indexed in the right position such that the piston will align to the little knob on that pad. All right, we've got the piston retracted, no signs of leaking. I'm checking these guide pins. I keep these lubricated with my, this is Permatex Silicon Ceramic Extreme Brake Parts lubricant. It is rubber compatible. I use it front and rear, and I've used it on these guide pins. These need to slide freely. If your guide pins at either end of the car do not slide freely, especially at the front, you're not going to have a good time. So I'm pulling off my Hawk HPS street pads and putting on the brand new Hawk DTC 60s. I would say at the rear, again, this caliper hardware, it'll last a couple of seasons, but at the front, pretty much any time I change pads, I am putting on the new clips at the front. All right, got our pads in place. Guide pins move freely and piston is fully retracted. We can go ahead and get the caliper back in place. In terms of the guide pin torque, I definitely put a little bit of torque on there because I've had one pop out at the track and then my caliper started to swing out of place in the middle of a session. So certainly don't skimp on the torque. There we go. Make sure the caliper still slides freely. Yep, looks great. This is a good opportunity to check the torque of all the nuts and bolts. I knew I had my rear toe link loosened yesterday, so this is my opportunity to get in there and to lock down that toe link. Lastly, this is a good opportunity to get under the car and to look and see if we've got any leaks, anything loose, hanging, dragging, anything weird going on. All right, no obvious leaks from the differential. So we are good to go here. All right, we have moved on here to the front end. We're gonna do the brakes, but before I forget to do it, I am gonna lock down that front tie rod from the alignment yesterday. Make sure that that does not rotate out of sync here. Perfect. All right. Steering tie rod, front toe locked in. Let's get this caliper cracked loose. You may find that the guide bolt will spin, in which case I use a 17, sort of very thin wrench to be able to get in on the flats of that guide pin, but we'll see if I can do it without it. Yep, relatively fresh guide pins. I do replace that hardware every now and then. Lower bolts out, caliper rotates up. Make sure the top bolt slides smoothly, and it does. Make sure that bottom bolt slides smoothly, and it does. Again, using the high temperature rubber compatible lubricant. Got to get that piston retracted. Take out the seat clamp. And I'll just, to save some time here, I can just go to the piston lip itself versus go all the way in the bore. So make sure the caliper is, and these are freshly rebuilt, new pistons, new seals. So yeah, that's retracting quite easily. Work it in a little bit more. Make sure it's flush with the caliper body. Perfect. No binding of the boot. Yep, boot is in good shape. Piston is fully retract. Get the first pad out. Get our pad in. This is new brake clip hardware for this season. I get new stuff every season. Checking the old pads. New pad going in. There we go. Make sure the pads slide freely within the grooves. Sometimes they're cut such that they're a little tight in the caliper bracket, and you don't necessarily want that because they can expand and they can start to bind up and cause brake drag. Get that lower bolt back in. Perfect. Plenty of smooth gliding caliper motion, letting us know we got that piston all the way back in. Get her locked down. All right, good and tight. A little discussion on spark plugs for the RX-8. Now, unfortunately, I wish I had learned this lesson earlier, but on my white car, I had run OEM plugs pretty much for the duration of its lifetime. So whatever was specified from the factory, those NGKs, I had run those. At one point I pulled the plugs, just to inspect them, maybe clean them, and I had noticed that on one of the leading plugs, the electrode had been burned off. It was missing, and I thought, well, gee, that's awful strange. I've never seen that failure before. But when I started to look into spark plugs, especially used in racing conditions, I found that the factory plugs might be a little bit too hot in heat range for racing conditions. So you want to run plugs as hot as possible prior to getting knock and prior to getting things overheated. The spark plug can run so hot under racing conditions that you can actually get so much heat that it distorts the plug holes in the rotor housings, and that is not good. So what was suggested to me was to install quarter plugs. It's a trade-off because the RX-8 is fairly susceptible to fouling over the plugs with how dirty it burns and how much oil it injects. So there's certainly a balance for a car that is driven on the street, at Autocross, and at track. But what I have found is that the NGK R7440A, the 9 heat range, I think the factory leading plug is maybe like a 7. And so this is a 9 heat range. This is a traditional electrode resistor style plug, so not a huge departure from the stock plug, but this racing plug with the 9 heat range, I think works very well for a car that's doing a lot of street driving, a lot of autocross driving, and a little bit of track driving. If it's a dual purpose car that is driven on the street, but you're doing more track than anything else, I have used the R6601 10 range. The 10 range, another step colder even than those previous plugs. I don't know that that's a resistor type. You can see this is a lot smaller than this one, but it works fine in the engine, and the factory spark plug boot still fits fine on this smaller plug, but this has no electrode. So this is crazy looking. I don't know if you all have ever seen this, but this is a racing plug NGK, no center electrode to burn off, so nothing there to fail. And I've run these in a dual purpose car here, street driving, autocross driving, track driving, and they never fouled over to the point when I got misfire. So even with a lot of all that gentle street driving, at least for me, these never fouled over. Now each season I do remove them, and I've got a sandblaster, a pneumatic sandblaster, I'll stick them in there and it'll blast off the electrodes. I do that for all of my plugs. But long story short, when it is the off season, when I'm doing nothing but street driving, I will put factory plugs back in this because that heat range works the best for street driving. But when it comes to be racing season, especially before my first track day, that's what I'm considering moving to the 9 or even the 10 heat range plug. Something that is better matched for what the engine operating conditions are going to be. So we'll go ahead and try to show these plugs being installed. As one of the other commenters on my videos have said before, it is not super straightforward. So we're looking in through the driver's side wheel well, and you can kind of see the plugs from this angle here. So this is really the only way you can access them. What I didn't note is that I don't play around with the trailing plugs. So I leave the OEM trailing plugs on. I'm really just swapping out the leading plugs based on my driving conditions. Once you've got the plug cracked loose, if your rotor housings are in good shape and you've used anti-seize, this plug should spin out by hand. If they do not spin by hand, I'd recommend picking up a spark plug chaser tool, basically a tap for spark plug holes. And I'd recommend cleaning up those threads because this will make your life much, much easier. All right, folks, we've got our 7440 9 heat range plug anti-seized, ready to go in. Of course, start it by hand. It's threading super smoothly, which is what we want to see. Yeah, that spark plug chaser tool was worth every dollar. All right. So I'm using a 3/8 inch ratchet with a universal joint and a long extension to get it out of the engine bay here. So I'll come around, and maybe this is tough to see, but you can see we've got a reach into the engine bay using this setup here. I have in the past used dielectric grease on the boots for the ignition wires, and that's generally a good practice, but I found at times that dielectric grease slicked things up so much that the boots were popping off of the spark plugs, causing misfires. Obviously, it's not going to fire well if your electrode is not making contact with the plug. So I've actually gotten into the habit of just simply not using the grease and just putting them on dry. Since then, I've never had them back off of the shank of the spark plug, and I've never had any misfires, and they haven't seized to the shank of the spark plug either. So just something to consider, especially if you're tracking your car. All that's left now is to put the ignition wires back on the plugs. But while I'm under here, I'm checking for anything loose. I'm looking at the brake hoses, making sure they're in good shape, and I'm looking for leaks under the car, anything out of the ordinary. And it's good practice. I had just put this coilover kit on, so everything is torqued to spec, but it'd be good practice to check all of your suspension bolts and make sure everything is snugged down properly. Now, prior to this, I had also done engine oil and filter and transmission fluid, and I'm going to be taking this car out for a street drive to help start to bed in the brake pads and to scrub in the tires. And after that, the differential will be warm enough that I'll be able to drain and do that fluid as well. With fresh fluids, no leaks, and good condition brakes and tires, we're ready for our first track day. Stay tuned to a more detailed review where I deep dive into the Bilstein PSSs and I look at street driving, autocross, and track. I look forward to seeing you then.